So this is lab 6 out of your book for R&R and a timing belt. This is a task that everybody should know how to do. It applies to doing timing chains as well. If you can do a belt like this, you can do some of the intricate chains that you'll see today as well. But there's still a lot of cars out on the road that have a timing belt. And a timing belt has a maintenance interval that it should be changed at before it breaks. They construct engines a couple of different ways. There's terminology that they use that's called freewheeling or an interference engine. A freewheeling engine is what it sounds like, that if the timing belt broke and our cam and crank came out of time, remembering that the crankshaft controls piston movement and the camshaft controls valve movement, if those came out of time with each other and valves were not closing to get out of the way of the piston, a freewheeling motor means that even if a valve were fully open and a piston came all the way up to top dead center, that they could not touch each other. An interference motor is what it sounds like, that if the valve were open and the piston came up, they would hit each other and bend the valves. The severity of that depends on the manufacturer and how much tolerance they have. But some of them will clip the valves and bend them. Others are severe, and I've had cars that broke the valves off and even stabbed them through the piston. And so it's important to know for the customer's sake whether they have an interference or a freewheeling motor. Out here in the shop, I've got a timing belt spec book that we use to do this lab that has a lot of information about whether the engine that you're working on is freewheeling or interference, what the interval is, and that they recommend replacing the belt and so forth. That information in that book comes from a little manual that looks like this that's made from Autodata. If you find that you're doing a lot of timing belts, pick yourself up one of these books because they're really handy. You'll see, I'll post the information that's in the little shop folder. I'll post it online and scan it to where it's in our lab file. And you can see the type of information that's there. Very quality information, has all the information you need to be able to do any timing belt that you come across. And shows good pictures of the timing marks, how they line up, how to do the job. Torque specs are all included. Real nice book for the price. So interference or freewheeling, some of the stuff that's in that lab book will ask you questions like that, that I want you to consult the information that I'll provide you there for this timing belt job. Before you ever, and let me say this. It's important to do timing belts before they break, right? Maintenance is cheaper than repairs. An average timing belt job nowadays, when I was doing them, they were $450 to $650 for most cars. And nowadays the labor rates have gone up, so it's probably, $550 to $750. And, the way that you want to do these jobs, one of the warnings I want to give you is when you do a timing belt, you do a water pump together. And whatever components go with it, they make kits to where you do timing belt and water pump, all the idler pulleys, new tensioner. That would really be the ideal way to go because especially on an interference motor, because if it comes out of time, we're bending the valves. And you can add $1,000 to the dollar amounts that I gave you. So if it was $550, it's $1,550 because now we're pulling the heads. If it was $750, it's $1,750 because now we're pulling the heads with bent valves. And in some cases, you end up doing the motor because it breaks the valves off and stabs them through the piston. So it's important to do timing belt and all those related components would be advisable. At the very least, you're going to always do a timing belt and water pump together. This construction of this motor, the timing belt does not drive the water pump, but there's a fair amount of them that are set up where the timing belt drives the water pump. However, even on this one, the water pump is still behind the timing belt. I would recommend to do it even in those cases because you're already there. It's an extra 30 minutes or so to do the water pump plus the cost of the part. So it's advisable to do timing belt and water pump even if it's not driven. It's mandatory in my book to do timing belt and water pump together if the timing belt drives the water pump, because timing belts are typically replaced anywhere from 60,000 to 120,000 miles depending on the manufacturer for the first time. The water pump bearings have 60,000 miles of wear on them, 100,000 miles of wear on them when you go in after this timing belt. And so when that timing belt gets replaced, it'll be loose like this one. So you can see this one is relatively loose. And so it doesn't have a lot of tension on it, and that belt has stretch. And that'll be the case when you go in to do them. That belt, that's why we replace them. The belt stretches, they get brittle, they're likely to break and come out of time. Now, on a freewheeling motor, it just leaves the customer stranded. On an interference motor, it costs them a lot more money. And so in that case, do timing belt and water pumps together. When you don't, then that old loose belt that wasn't putting a lot of tension on the shaft of the water pump will now be nice and tight, and it'll pull up on the shaft of that water pump, and then it usually causes a leak within a few months after doing the timing belt. And what happens, I've been in the case before where I give the customer the option, right? Where I say, well, you know, I would recommend you do the timing belt and water pump together. Like, nah, I just want to do the timing belt. And even though you quoted them timing belt and water pump, they get amnesia by the time they come back with a leaky water pump. Like, what? You're going to charge me again? You were just in there, right? Like, well, I told you to do the water pump back then. No, you didn't. So to stay out of those kind of pissing matches with customers, my advice is do the timing belt and water pump together, or don't do the job at all. It's not worth ruining your reputation with the community of people thinking you wronged them when you should have just done the job right the first time. Even though you didn't do anything wrong, you told them they should have done the water pump, they forgot, they're still going to think bad of you. And so it's not worth the bad PR to just not do the job right. And so there's one right way to do these jobs: timing belt and water pump together, or don't even bother doing it. So when I get in there, I look at them, it's going to give you instructions in this manual on how to line up the marks. You want to make sure that the belt is see what condition it's in. If it's loose, this one is loose. In here, it's giving you instructions. One of the things I want to warn you about is when you get into this and you get this timing belt off, because the belt keeps the cam and the crank in time, would you ever want to turn the crankshaft in a full circle when the belt is off? No, because you might make the valves hit the piston. Would you ever want to turn a camshaft in a full circle when the belt is off? No. So you be careful. You can feel them hit if they hit. And so you don't turn stuff and force it in a full circle. You can bend the valves. When the belts are moved, you be very careful that you don't turn these cam or crank in full circles. So there's instructions in here. You want to read those over, make sure you understand what to do. The removal procedure is to turn the crankshaft clockwise until the marks 8 and 9 line up. If you refer to the diagram, then you can see that 9 are the marks up here on our camshaft, and then 8 is the mark on the sprocket. So we can't see the sprocket with this pulley on, so we're going to have to remove that pulley, and then we're going to line up our marks. So we'll go ahead and get after that. Now, some of the crank pulleys, harmonic balancers, will pop off like this one does. If you just work this one, it'll come off pretty easily. Others, you have to use a press, special tool to grab the pulley and press against the crank and pull them off. So now we're going to line our marks up. Once we have that, we can thread that same crank bolt right back in, and then use that to turn the crankshaft and get our marks to line up. So I'm going to do that. And you always want to turn them in their normal direction. So this one rotates clockwise. So I can see my mark on the pulley right here, and that's lined up there. But my marks, I've got dots on my cams. The dots are 180 out right now. So that was one turn of the crank, so I need to make a second turn to line my crank back up. And you always start by lining the crankshaft up. If you pass it, then you got to make 2 full turns, because you don't ever want to rotate these motors backwards. So I've got a mark that lines up, and it looks just like what's in the diagram in the book that I'll post. The marks on our cams we'll go ahead and look at. And so on here, if I look at this one's off a tooth. This one is on. That one's off a tooth. And this one's on. So I've got one that's off a tooth, and so we'll address that and get that corrected when we get done. So now we're going to pull the tensioner off here like it says to do in the instructions. We'll take our tensioner bolts out there and remove our tensioner. Now, a couple of things about this tensioner. When I get it removed here, so now the belt's gonna go out of time, which we're not worried about, but it's a couple of things you would pay attention to. The bolts for this tensioner, if we stack them up next to each other, you can see that they're not the same length. So you make sure that when you take note of where they go. And just to help you out, in the instructions here in the lab book, I have them marked long bolt and short bolt. So the long bolt goes on the bottom and the short bolt goes up on top. And so my advice to you would be that when you take stuff off like that, you pay attention that the bolts are the same length or not, and then you stack them back, you put them back in the part they came off of, and then you set them in place so that you don't lose track of them. Now, we're going to take our belt loose. And then you can see that the cam's twanged out of time. So these ones popped and they're out of time, so we'll have to line those back up. Now, when you get the belt off, you want to inspect it, see if you have any missing teeth, things like that. Look at the condition. The reality is, timing belts are always changed by a mileage interval. And so just because the belt looks fine, we would never say, oh, well, it's fine. If you have a customer, sometimes you'll end up in situations where you have a customer that says, that just bought the car, and you figure out, oh, it's got a timing belt. And then you go and look it up and say, oh, well, it's due every 90,000 miles, right? And they say, well, can you look at it and tell me whether I need to change it? I'll look at it, and unless it looks brand new, like a brand new set of tires that has perfect sidewalls on it or stuff like that, then I'll never tell them anything. In most cases, I'm just going to turn it right back around on them and say, well, your manufacturer recommends you change it at 90,000 miles. And they'll say, well, do you think I should change it? I'll say, well, when's the last time you changed it? I don't know. I just bought the car. Well, then you decide. This is an interference motor. If it bends, the $650 I'm quoting you today will be $1,650 if it breaks and bends the valves. And so you let them decide. Put it right back in their court. It's their car. They get to decide. They have to live with the consequences of their own choices. You tell them, hey, look, it's due every 90,000 miles. If you don't know when it was changed last, I don't either. So that's on you. You decide whether you want to do it or not. This is how much it would cost. So get our belt and set it off to the side. While you have your belt removed, you're going to spin your pulleys. So you're going to listen to them and spin them. And so in this case, if you're going to reuse them, then at the very least you want to inspect whether they're good or not. And so on this one, good or bad? If you can hear it, it's bad. That's a bad pulley. Another bad pulley. That's the only good one. So this pulley's fine. These two are bad. They would need to be replaced. So then the next thing that we're going to do, we're going to go ahead and kind of makeshift line our marks back up. So since those cams jump, what you're going to want to do is grab a wrench. So we'll grab a wrench, not a ratchet. So the reason why I want a wrench is because if this cam wants to jump one way or the other, and then I can hold it with a wrench. With a ratchet, it would zip the ratchet once it overspins. What's putting pressure on these cams is the valve springs. And so on here I've got a mark right here, a dot. I'm going to line that up with my arrow over here, and if you're nice and careful, then it'll stay for you. So same for this one. We'll line this guy back up to the closest direction. So get that guy lined back up. That one's fine right there. This one is also fine. So I can deal with those. Now, you're going to have to learn to work by yourself. This would be the time that you would change the water pump, by the way. Be a piece of cake. You can see it's got 5 or 6 bolts right there. Bang that out. This would be you're going to have to learn to work by yourself, and I'm going to show you one of the little okie tricks that I do. When you install this timing belt, you're going to start at the crank. And so when I start it on the crank, then once, it doesn't matter where I put it, But I use a little piece of hose and I'll shove it up underneath. If you want to use a pair of like vice grips or something, sometimes you can pinch it gently with a pair of vice grips or like spring clamp pliers. But now when I start from here, it's held in place on the crank because I don't want it to jump, and I'm going to pull it tight all the way around back to the tensioner side. One of the things that we're going to need to do before we get too far is to press this tensioner back in if you're going to reuse it. Now, in inspecting this tensioner, I can see that it's leaking oil. If I try to pull on it, the end of it comes out, so this is freaking broke. You would change this for sure. I should not be able to push this one down by hand, but it's been studentized over the years. This is a good one that no matter how hard I push on this one, I'm not making this one go anywhere. So a good tensioner will be super solid, very difficult to press in. These are hydraulic tensioners here. They're a little self-contained. Some of them that you'll come across would be mechanical where you self-adjust them. This one and the one on this car is hydraulic. Some of the Hondas and some of the Acuras, or not, well, Acuras too, but Volkswagen products like Audi and Volkswagen and trying to think of anybody else. Subaru has some manual tensioners that you set the tension manually like you would a drive belt. So to press this tensioner back in, if you were going to reuse it, you're going to put it in the vise. And then I have a set of pins that we can pin this tensioner in. If you get a new tensioner when you buy a kit, and like I say, kits are so common. They sell timing belt and water pump kits with tensioner and idlers, but they're a pretty common thing. You find a pin that's going to fit well and fit through in that hole, and then we're just going to use the vise to slowly turn this in. Excuse me. So get this set up in the vise, and then if you were ever to reuse a tensioner like this, you're basically counting on it lasting another interval for this timing belt and not breaking. And so if it's a 60,000 mile interval, you're expecting it to last 60,000, 90, or 100,000, depending on the interval of the belt. So look them over real well. This one's bad. We're going to reuse it for demo purposes here at the college, but if this was a real car, there's absolutely no way I would reuse it. And if you're reusing a tensioner, you want to make sure that you don't damage them when you press them in. They're hydraulic. And so they've got just an oil-filled chamber with an orifice in it with pressure behind it. And so you have to give it time for it to bleed that pressure back and forth. So you go super slow. So when you're pressing this in, you're going to lightly push pressure and just slightly and gently force this in until your holes line up through here. So we're going to gently push this in. This would probably take you, if you were using a good one, it would probably take you 10 minutes. 5 to 10 minutes to do this. Being that this one is no good, it pushes in readily and easily for us. We just line up our holes. Once your holes line up, then you put the pin in. And so you want to make sure that the pin goes all the way through to the other side. So we'll press this in until the pin lines up all the way and goes through to the other side. So our pin's in place. So when you get this on the car, then you pull the pin, you count to 3, and you throw it. So that's grenades. This one we're going to leave the pin in until we make sure that all the marks are lined up perfectly. Then the last thing I do is pull the pin because I don't want to have to go through doing that again if I painstakingly took my time to press this in. So this is ready to be reinstalled with the pin on it. And the pin just goes through a hole that's preset in it. The new ones that you get when you buy a kit will already come with the pin in them, so you don't have to worry about it. So now we're going to start this belt. So I've got it locked in on the crank over there with my little piece of hose. It's all fitted into place, so I'm going to pull it tight like that. And then I'm going to start going over my belt. So one of the things I forgot to grab is little clips. So I usually have little clips like these, and these are just binder clips. But I'll have little clips like that in my toolbox so that after I get this all set, and it's where I want it, I can clip it into place. So once I get it set, I'll make sure my marks do line up. So I'm happy with that one. I'm happy with that one. And you want to make sure you look square down the gear and you don't play games with yourself and kind of look to the side or something and make it line up. It either lines up or it doesn't. And so then on this one, we're going to come over. That one doesn't quite line up, so we're going to help her out and let this move a little bit this way so I can get my cogs in. I want to see how that guy lines up. I'm happy with that. So then we'll fit it over this one. See how that lines up. So then this is a good time to grab another one of these clips and clip this, because even if this wants to move back and it jumps back that way, if it stays on these cogs, it can't go anywhere. So I'll come back and look and make sure that my marks line up good, and they do. And so then I can go ahead and kind of rack all the tension over this way to where it's nice and tight all the way over, and all my slack is right here on my tensioner side. So then I can come over and just get my tensioner fitted in. So my tensioner in place, grab my bolts, long one on the bottom, short one on the top, get those in place. So this has also been studentized to where these are stripped, but this would also be something that you would typically torque. So I'll get those snugged up. All right. So then, now re-inspect your marks. Make sure you're happy with your marks. Good. I like those. Except I don't like this one. All right. So this one is off a tooth. So being that this one is off a tooth right here, the tooth that it lines up with is not the one that we want. I'm going to teach you a little trick. That way you never do this more than once. So what we're going to do, just as a little trick, is we're going to draw our own mark on the belt. So where the dot is here. Where I want it is the tooth next to it. And so what I'm going to do is draw a line on the belt where I want to line it up. All right? So where I want to line it up is there. I'm going to take and clip this so that this cam can't move, that cam can't move. And then all we'll do is just take this loose and reset this tooth to my pin mark on the belt. And so you just line them right back up with each other where you want the dot to be and which cog on the belt. As long as it doesn't jump on the crank, wham bam, you only screwed up once. And so what we'll do is get this apart so that we can just reset that. And because I didn't pull the pin in my tensioner, then no big deal on that part. I can just keep that and it's ready to go to be reinstalled. So now I'll get my wrench. So even if it jumps real bad like that, that does not matter, because all that I have to do is get my tooth lined up with the pin mark that I made. And as long as I do that, then it's in time. So that's exactly where I wanted it. Line my pin mark up on my belt with my dot. Now I get it back here, and because I had all my belt clipped down, no big deal. Even though it jumped pretty bad, I just line all my marks right back up. Wham bam, very quick little fix. And I show you that on purpose because it's common to do that. Truth be told, I didn't do that on purpose this time. But sometimes that will happen. I'm glad it happened so I can show you the fix for that. So you just do a little pin mark on there. Now all my marks are lined up. So I get all my slack out, get my tensioner snug back up. And then the last thing that you're gonna do is get your clips off of here, and you're gonna roll this motor over twice. And we still haven't pulled the pins. We'll get our little rubber holder out of there. Don't want to forget that in there. We're gonna roll this motor over twice and make sure that our marks line back up. There's 180 out on my cams. So now I'm lined back up on my crank. Come back, look, that tooth's cherry, that one's cherry, that one, and now that one. So all my marks are lined up. Now that all your marks are lined up, you can pull your pin. And that's gonna let that tensioner push out, grab all the tension on the belt, and then make it all nice and tight. So that would usually push this over real nice and tight. So now we're gonna get into torquing some stuff. So I wanna torque my tensioner. We're gonna end up torquing our crank bolt, but we're gonna do two different ways. If we look up in the book what the spec is to torque the tensioner. So we can look up in our spec book here, our tensioner bolts, and it shows bolts 13. So when we look at 13, what does it say? 14 foot-pounds. So torque the bolts 11 to 14 foot-pounds. So I want to show you first off, when you grab a torque wrench, I'm going to just show you on this one because those bolts are stripped right now. So when I roll up here, I'm going to just start at 5 foot-pounds, and I want to show you something. And usually in class, I would have everybody come around and feel this torque wrench, but this is 5 foot-pounds. 5 pounds, I can do that with my pinky because this is more than a foot long. The truth is, when you get down to real small torque specs like that, it's not much of a click. So you could fart on this thing and get 5 foot-pounds. Most of your guys' backpacks weigh more than 5 pounds. 5 foot-pounds isn't squat. If I go up now to, let's do 40 foot-pounds. So get this set at 40. We should hear much more of a click on this. Which that is the torque spec for that bolt. So notice that after it clicks, if I wanted to pull on this more, I could tighten it past 40 foot-pounds. So when you use a torque wrench, you stop when it clicks. The 14 foot-pounds that we had before is going to be pretty light. So if we did 14 foot-pounds on those bolts that we had before, set that at 4, this would be 14. It would go through and tighten both of these. 14. Doesn't take a whole lot. All right, we click that one off, 14 foot-pounds, we're good to go. You would tighten all of these to specs if you've replaced them. So then the last thing, since we're all set there, now we want to put our harmonic balancer back on and tighten that. And so if we look up our specs for our harmonic balancer, we can see that's also in the information that is in those little books or in service information. This is one of the items that I always torque because it's held on with a keyway and it's pinching the bolt into place that pinches this crank sprocket and the balancer in place so you don't ruin a crankshaft or have a keyway shear. And so we're just going to zap this off. If you use an impact gun, it'll come off and the timing marks and belt won't even move. So this has got a keyway in it that we want to line up on the crank. So we'll get that lined back up on our crank there. Get our bolt started. I often, in putting crank bolts in, would typically put Loctite on these. So that would be something I would often do when I would put a crank bolt in on a customer's car. So now we're going to come around and we need a torque spec. So if I look up in my book, my torque spec for my crank bolt, it shows 116 to 123 foot-pounds. So if I grab my torque sticks, I should have one in there that's 120 foot-pound, that one. And so I can tighten it to this 120 foot-pound. if I have a socket. And that'll be acceptable. You won't always have room to hit them with a torque stick, but when you do, it's nice and quick and easy and torques it to specs. It'll make these go real simple. I'll usually hold the pulley so that it can't spin on me. And then that is it. So zap that guy down. I don't know if I want to be on level 3 on this guy. So that's nice and tight, 120 foot-pounds. Spun it twice, checked our marks, everything's good to go, got the pin out of the tensioner, then you put all the rest of this together. This job gives us a labor time on this in these books. We've got, this is what, I'll just look at it, what the labor time is on this one. It shows about a 4-hour job. So on here, you've got a good, at this point, 1.5 to 2 hours worth of, probably an hour to get it apart and another, 1.5 hours going back together. If you're a good tech, you'll get it done faster. You'll beat the book time. But the more of these you do, the easier they get. But there's a good 1 hour to 2 hours worth of work and covers on this that's out in the open for you right now. There'd be plastic covers over this, all your drive belts and everything else that would drive this water pump and everything that would be on front of this. I also want you to consider, if I turn this sideways, that's how most of these motors would be in the car, is sideways like that. And so you'd be working in a space that's about like this. And so to have the opportunity to do some of your first timing belts where you can stare this thing in the face and really see well makes a big difference. A lot of the others, your strut tower would be right here and you'd be trying to see these marks with a mirror. And so valuable exercise to get practice on this. You know the gist of it in doing this now. So that's it for your timing belt lab.